J.R.R. Tolkien was undoubtedly the father of modern fantasy, and while he may not have invented elves, dragons, and dark lords, he's the guy who made them cool. Without Tolkien, the fantasy landscape would look incredibly different today. Here's the untold truth of the man himself. According to biography, Tolkien was born John Ronald Reuel Tolkien in Bloemfontein, South Africa in 1892. When he was still pretty young, his mother moved him and his younger brother to Sarehole in Birmingham, England. His father stayed behind in South Africa and later died from rheumatic fever when Tolkien was just 4 years old. Then his mother died too when he was just 12. Tolkien spent his teenage years as an orphan, living with a relative and in a number of boarding homes, before he was finally taken under the guardianship of a Catholic priest named Father Francis. It's impossible to say how much of that difficult childhood informed his writing, but Tolkien's stories do tend to have an edge to them, so it's entirely possible that Tolkien's early days made him the writer he was. In the Lord of the Rings trilogy, Frodo almost falls prey to Shelob, a giant spider who lives in the mountain pass into Mordor. And that's not the only Tolkien story that features monstrous arachnids. Bilbo also encounters a forest full of spiders in The Hobbit. So clearly, Tolkien had a thing about spiders. But why? Well, Tolkien's fear may have stemmed from an encounter he had as a small child living in South Africa. According to J.R.R. Tolkien, a biography, Tolkien was bitten by a tarantula while learning to walk. Tolkien, however, admitted he had little memory of the event and actually claimed to like spiders to the point where he would rescue them if he found them in distress. Having dismissed the idea that a spider encounter had anything to do with Shelob, Tolkien instead blamed his son Michael. Michael was evidently terrified of spiders, so Tolkien did what any good father would do. He wrote two of the world's scariest spider attack scenes with the sole intention of scaring the hell out of his son. At first glance, the name Bag End might seem like it was plucked out of thin air. After all, it's vaguely similar to the surname of Tolkien's two most famous heroes, and you can't help but get the impression that the word end refers to a final destination, the place the hobbits plan to return to when they're done saving Middle-earth. Amazingly, however, Tolkien didn't actually make up the name Bag End. According to the Tolkien Library, he borrowed it from his Aunt Jane, who owned a farm in Dormston in Worcestershire, England. That farm was not only called Bag End, but it may have been called that since as far back as the Anglo-Saxon era. There are some Tolkien scholars who even think he adopted more than just the name and that some of the farm's features also showed up in his description of the fictional Bag End. But Tolkien himself never had much to say about the real Bag End, besides saying it was at the end of a lane leading to it and no further. So it's really impossible to say how much inspiration he took from the place. When Tolkien was 16, he befriended a 19-year-old neighbor named Edith, and the two soon fell in love. According to biographics, Tolkien's guardian, Father Francis, thought the relationship between Tolkien and Edith was scandalously inappropriate because Edith was a Protestant. Consequently, Francis forbade Tolkien from seeing her again until he turned 21 years old. Tolkien dutifully obeyed, and the night before his 21st birthday, he wrote Edith a letter containing a marriage proposal. Their marriage produced 4 children and at least 2 memorable characters. One of Tolkien's most famous tales is that of Beren and Lúthien, which tells of a mortal who fell in love with the daughter of the Elven King after watching her dance in a glade.
What happened to her? She died.
This story was, in fact, inspired by a real-life moment in which Tolkien watched Edith dance in a clearing of white hemlock flowers. Tolkien took his adoration of Edith and Lúthien quite literally to the grave. On their shared headstone, the word Lúthien is inscribed below Edith's name, and the word Beren is described below Tolkien's. Even as a child, Tolkien had a talent for languages and a great interest in learning them. Biographics called Tolkien an exceptional student who was capable of easily mastering ancient and modern languages. He knew 4 languages by the time he was a teenager, and as an adult, he could speak Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, German, Dutch, French, Spanish, Italian, Welsh, Russian, and Finnish. He wasn't content with just languages that you could use to speak to actual living people either. He also knew a whole load of ancient languages, including Old Norse, Old English, Middle English, and Medieval Welsh. And when Tolkien wasn't learning how to speak languages, he was inventing them. According to Hobbits, Elves, and Wizards, the wonders and worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, Tolkien had already created a couple of brand new languages before he'd even become a teenager. Over the course of his lifetime, he would go on to create more than a dozen more languages. These weren't just some cute pseudo-languages like Pig Latin either. These were real languages. His first attempt at a language was called Nefuran, which was based heavily on Spanish but featured its own grammatical rules. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Tolkien didn't stop there. The author also had his own system that encompassed not just the modern versions of his invented languages, but their historical context too. On top of all that, he also designed his own alphabets from time to time, the most famous of which are the scripts and symbols featured in his Middle-earth stories. Tolkien always denied that he'd been influenced by his time in the trenches during World War I, but it's hard not to believe that the Battle of the Five Armies was at least subconsciously influenced by his own personal experiences at the Battle of the Somme in 1916. In a letter Tolkien wrote in 1960, he did admit that he might have drawn from the landscape of northern France after the Battle of Somme for his portrayal of the dead marshes, but he seemed reluctant to take it any further than that. There's no doubt, though, that Tolkien was affected by the Great War. According to the shell-shocked Hobbit, The First World War, and Tolkien's Trauma of the Ring, he spent months in and out of the trenches and, although he managed to avoid being wounded, did end up with trench fever, which was caused by bacteria spread via a body louse. Trench fever finally got Tolkien sent home, but many of his friends died, and no one can live through war without changing just a little. Unless you've received a specific education in early English literature, there's a good chance you've never read Beowulf. Tolkien had, though. In fact, he not only read it, but he also called it the greatest of the surviving works of ancient English poetic art, and, as if he wasn't already busy creating his own languages, also produced a translation of the story. According to the New York Times, Tolkien was initially against the idea of translating the original Old English into modern English and wondered if it would be an abuse to turn the famous poem into plain prose. He never really changed that view either, since he eventually expressed dissatisfaction at his own translation and pretty much shelved it entirely until 88 years later his son Christopher dusted it off and submitted it for publication. Interestingly, Tolkien actually borrowed material from the 1,000-year-old manuscript. That scene where Bilbo steals from the dragon Smaug, for example, was practically lifted right off Beowulf's pages. In the 1930s, Tolkien was working as a professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford University, and like all college professors, part of his job was to grade the work of his students. Now that's the kind of gig that would bore anybody, but to someone with an imagination as vivid as Tolkien's, it must have been practically soul-destroying. So Tolkien found a way to distract himself from his work. According to The Independent, he put down his students' coursework and picked up a blank sheet of paper. On it, he wrote, "In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit." That was the genesis of one of the most beloved children's stories of all time, a novel that has been continuously in print ever since its original publication date in 1937. It was an instant success, too. Allen and Unwin printed an initial run of 1,500 copies, which sold out within 3 months. The Hobbit we know today is actually a revision of that first manuscript. Tolkien rewrote the second edition so it would be a better companion to its follow-up, The Lord of the Rings. But it all began with a few dull exam papers at Oxford University. Tolkien's Middle-earth may be pure fantasy, but like all authors, he drew inspiration from the things and places he encountered in his life. The Independent says the One Ring at the center of the Lord of the Rings trilogy was based on an anecdote Tolkien once heard about a cursed ring that was found near the ruins of a Roman temple. Bilbo's home, the Shire, was based on Tolkien's childhood home in Sarehole, England. In fact, the Sarehole Mill was a particular source of inspiration to Tolkien. In The Hobbit, Tolkien describes Bilbo running as fast as his furry feet could carry him down the lane, past the Great Mill, across the water, and then on for a mile or more. If you were ever to go on a tour of the places that inspired Tolkien's Middle-earth, you would also need to visit the Malvern Hills in the English counties of Worcestershire, Herudfordshire, and Gloucestershire, which were the inspiration for Rohan and Gondor. Rivendell was inspired by a valley in the Swiss Alps, while the two towers themselves are echoes of Parrott's Folly and the Waterworks Tower in Edgbaston, a suburban area of Birmingham, England. The Hobbit was a runaway success, and whenever anything is a runaway success, there are people all over the world who want to get on board. According to Newsweek, a publisher in Berlin wrote to Tolkien to ask about printing a German translation of The Hobbit. In the letter, the publisher explained that they really wanted to print The Hobbit for sale in Germany, but before they could do that, Tolkien would have to prove he had Aryan descent.
Nazis. I hate these guys.
Tolkien was not only disgusted by the request, but also told his publisher that he was inclined to, quote, let a German translation go hang. And instead of just leaving it there, he actually wrote back. In his response, Tolkien said, I regret that I am not clear as to what you intend by Arish. I am not of Aryan extraction, that is Indo-Iranian. As far as I am aware, none of my ancestors spoke Hindustani, Persian, Gypsy, or any related dialects. But if I am to understand that you are inquiring whether I am of Jewish origin, I can only reply that I regret that I appear to have no ancestors of that gifted people. You tell him, Tolkien. Check out one of our newest videos right here, plus even more grunge videos about your favorite stuff are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.